Well, this is going to be a great show, guys. We have a special guest, Mr. Paul Stone. And what I'm really excited about is we never get to see Mr. Paul Stone. So we're going to talk about NCAA football, but hold the phone, Chuck. It's not going to be just about picks or anything like that. We're going to talk process. We're going to talk what's behind the effort and the success, because Paul is one of the most successful NCAA handicappers around. And quoting him from one of his podcasts, he's no couch potato eating moon pies and grape soda. It's a matter of shifting gears. And what I really like about this is athletes or bettors are like athletes. And if you're not preparing off season, that's where the champions are made. Go ahead and expand on that. How are you doing? I know that you're doing everything, a lot of prep. You've got like 50 bets already in, but tell the people your process of like what you've done to date and what you have going forward.
Well, first of all, Chris, it's great to be on with you guys and joining you for a little college football talk. But, for me, my process and the work on college football is just never ending. It certainly intensifies at different times of the year. But once the national championship game is played, that second Monday in January or whenever, I pretty much immediately shift gears to the in this case, the 2022 season most recently. With the transfer portal, especially, you have a large number of players getting into the portal right around season's end. So it's just again, it's never ending. It's about personnel. I develop power ratings, and from those power ratings, I develop my own personal betting lines, like many handicappers do. And then I use those betting lines to compare to the actual lines as they come out. And with so much competition and more than 30 states now having legalized gambling in some form, again, you've got more competition. So the games of the year and the week one college football lines and so forth are coming out earlier and earlier. So you just have to be prepared. You can't ever be caught with your, caught napping, caught asleep. You've got to be, in the work all the time. So that gives you a little bit of, insight as to my process, just consumption of a lot of information, a lot of relevant statistics, and again, just roster turnover. It used to be in college football, you would have just that natural roster turnover of players who, graduated or went to the NFL early or what have you. And now you have the additional layer of the transfer portal, which is basically just year-round free agency, and it affects rosters immensely, much more than just the natural cycle of graduation and other losses used to. And case in point, USC, you've got a team that was 4-8 last year, and largely through a new head coach, but mostly through the players that they've added through the transfer portal, a team that could possibly be top 10 in the wire service polls. I think they'll probably be top 15. But to go to 4-8 to top 15, let's say, in the wire service polls without having played a game is pretty significant. So it's a different world out there these days in college football.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad you mentioned that, because I hate the transfer portal, but that's a different story. It's a lot of work on our part. But you could really see some things develop. For example, Utah State last year. I don't know if you were in on them, but they had Arkansas State's coach. They changed from one Anderson to another. A really good coach, came into a good situation, took with him their quarterback, took with him their Sun Belt perceived player of the year that was coming over, just revamped the entire roster. And you had a team that was basically left for 2-10 the year before that actually won the title in the Mountain West. So the landscape is really changing, and I agree completely with the approach that you have to start early. Most people aren't going to start on the college football season until a week or two before the season begins. And although I don't start as early as you do, July 4th, really yesterday, signals, okay, now we're going to dig really deep into this. But I've already looked at past data. So I have a question for you, Paul. How much weight do you give on last year's data as you're going through And do you go back even more than 1 year? Because in certain instances, I go back longer if the coach has been there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I typically go back maybe 2 years. And as far as how heavily I weigh that data, it's going to depend primarily on how much roster turnover they've had. I mean, like, for instance, the team that I was just speaking of, USC, I don't know how much relevance their offensive data has from last year to this year. They have a significantly ramped up roster from an offensive standpoint. I mean, Lincoln Riley brings over Caleb Williams, so they've got one of the best quarterbacks in the country. They get Travis Dye from the University of Oregon, a running back who has over 3,000 career yards rushing. They get a receiver in Jordan Addison through the portal from Pitt, who was the Biletnikoff winner last year, over 100 catches. So they immediately go from a middling offense to one of the very top offenses in all of college football. So I don't know that last year's data or information is very relevant. So it just depends, but I look at it a little bit. It's not something that I rely on heavily. It certainly kind of establishes a baseline for the power rating that I'm going to ultimately develop and come up with. But it's certainly a piece of the puzzle, but not a huge piece. And again, with the transfer portal, probably a smaller piece than it used to be, say, 5 years ago.
I noticed in one of your pods that you mentioned 3 important issues that are important to you, and that is knowing all the coaches and identifying the teams with irreplaceable players. And thirdly, I'd like to get your take on watching games versus analyzing the stats. From both of you guys, I'd like to see you touch base on each of those issues.
I'm going to defer to Paul really quickly as I power up my computer. So go, Paul, first.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. I'm definitely a guy who leans more heavily on the crunching of numbers and the just taking in the statistics. I think our eyes, even if we're veteran observers, veteran handicappers, I think our eyes can sometimes deceive us. I like to watch more games early in the year because we spend all summer or all year basically developing power ratings and developing an opinion on all these teams. But until they roll out the cast in the last Saturday in August or in early September in their opening game, you really don't know what they're going to bring to the table, especially sometimes in the offensive line positions, and certainly the most important position in all of sport, the quarterback position. So I like to see how that new quarterback looks. I like to see how much protection they're giving him and those types of things. So I watch games more probably early in the year than late in the year. But I am more of a numbers guy. I look more at the statistical data that's out there and use that in a greater measure than the actual eyeball test, if you will.
Well, I just put the scrolling banner in the back. I've preached for years, don't believe your lying eyes. And I'm very statistical based. I don't have too much to talk about and offer with the NCAA. I used to do 35 games a week. I used to be at the Win on the openers. I'd have all my work done on all the games by halftime of the first games of NFL. And it just became too difficult when the scoring increased for me. I did a lot of run-based data analysis, and there's just fewer and fewer games for me to filter those qualifications in nowadays, which makes my job easier because I don't have to do as much because I'm filtering out teams that pass too much for what I do. I just can't seem to get those teams right ever. So I'm focusing on teams that only pass a certain amount of downs and such like that. I'm curious to what changes that you guys have made over the last 4 years or so when the scoring just blew up.
Well, Chris, the rushing data, the line of scrimmage data is something we've talked about for years, comparing how we look at run numbers and how I parse out sacks and not parse out sacks. And when Paul mentioned about we don't get a lot of data that we can use in the past from a team like USC, who's completely flipped their coaching and roster. There are some teams like Iowa and TCU until Gary Patterson left and so on and so forth, where you have a lot of data. And I have backed data more than 20, 30 years on those teams where I look at line of scrimmage data and whether or not when it's predicted that they're going to dominate, have they covered the spread, how much have they covered the spread as a favorite, as a dog, and when they're not predicted to win. So I have a lot of data in that area that I use, and I continue to use to some extent until we get 3 or 4 data points into the new season. So now we've got 2022. I think, Chris, you've mentioned that after maybe 3 games, you cross over into 2022 data. I can't trust that data after just 3 games. If you look at a team like UCLA's upcoming schedule, the first 3 games of the year, it's going to be Alabama A&M, I think, and a couple of other teams. Bowling Green, I think, is in there. You know, you're comparing apples and oranges for UCLA's first 3 games versus somebody else's first 3 games. So, but there's a way to look at the data that way. If they're not meeting expectations, because I've got sheets on every team, if they're not meeting expectations after playing 3 very poor opponents, and their stats look good, but they're not as good as you think they should be after 3 games, there's a way to find some value going against those kinds of teams. So I'm a numbers guy, pretty much like the two of you sound. I will be asking a couple of questions later on about motivation. Chris, you mentioned score variance. The more points, it's just a little bit harder. Certainly, the one thing I would say is I will never play college teases because the variance is just too much for me. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I don't play any college teases.
No. What changes have you made since the elevated scoring has happened, Paul? And has it affected your win-loss at all?
Well, a lot of what I do is totals as well. So I play as many totals each week probably as I do sides. And scoring has certainly been impacted. I mean, the average college football game right now features 55 points over the last 3 years, right around 55 and a half points. College teams pass right now roughly 50% of the time. So it is a little bit different of a game. In the old days, there used to be, that stat, if you could figure out beforehand which team was going to do it. If a team rushed for over 200 yards, they were going to win the game and probably cover the game this percentage of the time and those types of things. And the running game is obviously just not quite as important now as it used to be. I think kids are growing up either to be the quarterback or the wide receiver. So I put a lot of my attention and focus on those positions. And, defense is not as important as it used to be in terms. Certainly, Georgia had a great defense last year, regardless of the era. And the team that wins the national championship is more than likely going to be, a top 3, top 5 team in scoring defense. But still, there used to be the old adage, defense wins championships. And now you maybe have to do a little bit more than just hold serve defensively. But at the same time, it's not as critical as it used to be. I mean, Ohio State this year, looking at 2022, you've got an Ohio State team that last year averaged almost 46 points a game. And I think the last 5 years, they've averaged at least 41 points a game. I can't recall how many points they allowed last year, but they weren't one of the better defensive teams in the country. They're going to be better defensively this year because they're going to be more experienced. But with that said, they're not going to be as good defensively, certainly not on the level of a Clemson this year defensively, but they're so good offensively. They're going to be some people's number 1 power ranked team. I personally have Alabama slightly ahead of Ohio State, but I think anybody that makes power ratings would agree, and maybe not anybody, but I think it's pretty clear cut that the top 2 power ranked teams this year in one order or the other are Alabama and Ohio State. So Defense doesn't play quite as big of a role as it used to. One thing I look at, and they've tried to speed up games, so it takes a little bit of this away, but it's pace of play, because I play totals. How fast do teams play? How many plays do they average a game? How many plays do they average a game when they play another team that plays fast? Conversely, how many plays do they average a game when they play somebody who wants to slow it down and grind it out and limit their number of plays? So look at those things pretty extensively. I'm not a modeler per se. A lot of what I do is by instinct, based on over, 30, 35 years of doing this. So a little bit unique. I'm probably a Neanderthal to some, but until, that I see that it's clearly not working and that I'm clearly not attaining the type of results that I have historically or that I want to be attaining, I'll keep kind of doing it by feel. And as I like to say, it's 50% science and the other 90% is art. So that's kind of how I go about it.
I wanted to ask you to throw a dog a bone, and you actually did throw us a bone, because I think the number one question I actually get that I can't answer people with is totals. And you discussed pace of play, and I know Ron has some interest in this. What other bones can you throw us on how you're coming up with your numbers for totals?
Early in the year, and again, Ron made an excellent point about after 3 games in college football, teams in college football play such disparate non-conference schedules. If you get an FCS opponent in there, and if you get a non-group of 5 and one of the weaker teams among the 131 teams now playing FBS football, you're not going to get a true reflection. And I don't consider FCS statistics. I'm going to look at the box, but I'm not going to put it into my numerical data. So I ignore FCS opponents, and I pretty much ignore games against weaker FBS opponents as well. But as far as, and I apologize, I lost my train of thought there. What was the original question?
The throw us a bone, or as many bones as you can, on how you come up with your totals numbers, because that's the number one question I get. And right. You mentioned the pace of play, of course.
Early in the year, I'm going to start again with an average game totaling 55 points. I'm going to know that an average team's going to score 27 and a half points rather a game against an average opponent, if that makes sense. And then you look at the previous year. I'm going to use those numbers. Their scoring offense against capable FBS opponents, their scoring defense against capable FBS opponents, and kind of come up with that total. And then, do the same.
How do you kind of do that, though?
Well, I mean, if there's 8 games for one team, that I see against opponents that are obviously going to vary in talent level, but if they're, top 75 or better, say, I'm going to get their scoring average from the previous year, offensively and defensively, and say they scored an average of 30 points a game, gave up an average of 22, then I'm going to come up with 52. If the other team played 10 games that I think were against opponents in the top 75 or better, I might come up with a total of 58, and then I'm at that 55 again, and then I'm going to make very subjective adjustments based on the offensive and defensive personnel this year compared to last year, and then adjust, tweak each team's numbers a little bit and kind of mix it up. Kind of like a cook without a recipe. I just kind of put a little bit of this in, a little bit of that, mix it up, and then I come up with what I think a total is. And then I look at the point spread, what I think the point spread is, and perhaps the actual point spread if one's been published. And then I attribute the, you look at that and you say, okay, it's 14 points, say Team A favorite over Team B, then you might, you might think, is that the losing team going to score, 24 and the winning team 38, or, 17 and 31, or whatever the case might be. And you just kind of decide, do you think that team's going to score more points than your total reflects, or less points? And the same thing from a defensive standpoint. So mine's very different than most people. My totals records have been very, very good, so I'm very comfortable with it. But it's
Well,
probably
we know your sides totals over like 7, 8 years and maybe 9 years or 10 years is about 56%, which is just awesome. What about your record in totals?
the overall record of 56% over the last 7 years is probably I would say totals are. I wish there was more balance there, but totals are probably better than 60%.
Oh wow, okay.
And sides obviously not in the low 50s.
There's theories out there in the NFL that conference games, especially later in the year, could be lower scoring and stuff like that. But if we talk about the NCAA, do you give any weight to totals as far as a conference game versus not being in a conference game?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, a conference game, if the coaching staffs are holdovers, especially if they've been there 3 or 4 years, and especially if they have a coach who's coached at the other school and knows that team's schemes and so forth on one side or maybe even both sides of the ball, I think those types of that type of familiarity, you might shade the total down in a conference game, based on that reasoning. I also might, it's kind of correlated, but when you get some of these late season games where a SEC team's either playing a FCS team or an outmatched FBS team in the midst of their conference schedule, sometimes a lot of those teams, Alabama's been a great example up until about 3 or 4 years ago, and I think maybe it stopped. But if you took the FCS team, if you took the game total under in those games featuring Alabama against the outmatched FCS, and then if you took the FCS team plus the points in the second half against Alabama, after Alabama had gone ahead about 35 or 42-0, I mean, it was like you combine those two, and it was like 20-0. I mean, it was you can, backdate that and look at it. But I think sometimes those SEC teams in those types of games, and maybe even in other conferences, they might tend to let off the accelerator a little bit, rest their starters because it's the middle of it, towards the end of the season, when injuries are starting to accrue and bumps and bruises are starting to accumulate, and they want guys to have some time off, and they might just not quite be as fully engaged to keep the foot on the gas as they might otherwise be. So, but in non-conference games, especially, teams that are, especially early in the year, if you think that, and a lot of it's going to depend on, I'm kind of thinking as I go here, how long is the starting quarterback going to play? Is there a Heisman candidacy in the works and those types of things? Is it a quarterback competition? That might lean me towards the over, because if you have a quarterback competition early in the year against a non-conference opponent, you don't want to have one quarterback play with the first team offensive line and the other competing quarterback to play with the second team offensive line, because you're not giving them both a fair opportunity. You're not comparing apples to apples. So those teams are going to have their first team offensive line in the game for a longer period of time. And both quarterbacks are going to be attempting at least to play at the best of their abilities, to try to produce points and to try to, sway the coaching staff's confidence in their corner. But hopefully that I kind of ramble a little bit, but hopefully that answers some of the questions. But I think the main thing is, if there's any one point, I think when you get to conference games where the teams have average to above average defenses and there's some familiarity there, when you're making your number, and sometimes the book does the same thing, but when you're making your total, you're going to shade it down perhaps slightly.
Revenge games are interesting to me. These are 18, 19, and 20-year-olds playing football. Assuming the same coaching staffs relatively and not too much transfer portal change, going historically, how much weight would you put on a revenge game? Whether it be a last-second field goal that beat them the year before, or something strange that happened where a controversial penalty or controversial fumble. What do you do with revenge games?
I'm going to give you my honest answer. I do very little. I'm not a revenge guy. revenge game guy much. You only play 12 games a year, regular season games a year. You might get a 13th if you play a conference championship. Then you'll get a 14th and maybe, 15 if you get into the playoff. But, there are exceptions. There's certainly bad blood between coaching staffs with the recruiting, with the NIL now. Obviously, one game to keep an eye on that features this dynamic is Alabama hosting Texas A&M this year. I think that situation from all angles benefits Alabama. That was one of the bets that I made at the South Point when Chris Andrews opened his games of the year in early June. I think it opened at 13, Alabama minus 13 at home against Texas A&M. I took Alabama minus 13 and a half. I have no doubt there that Jimbo, or rather Coach Saban, is not saying that A&M's done anything wrong, but he has made it clear that he thinks they're kind of, using the NIL rules to their benefit and maybe overstepping some boundaries. So I think he's going to make a statement or be out to make a statement. And you put a layer on top of that, the fact that they lost last year in College Station to the Aggies as I think about a 17-point favorite. I think the Crimson Tide have a lot of emotional advantages in their corner. But I'm not a big revenge guy. I think these guys, they only go to war so many times a year, and I think it's kind of overplayed. And if the bookmaker knows it, and it comes down to you might say, well, I really think there's some revenge in this game, but if bookmaker thinks there's more revenge than you do, if that makes sense, then the line's going to be shaded the other way. So, it's all kind of a cat and mouse game, but I'm not a revenge guy really at all. Not as much so as some people are.
How is, for me, and I don't think I'm alone at all with this, is I've lost a little bit of interest in NCAA football just because so few teams have a chance of winning. I mean, this year, everybody's saying there's only 2 teams that are, basically, able to win it. I mean, just add a couple more just for, for remote possibilities. But how does that affect your guys' handicapping at all? Have you noticed any sort of motivational differences? And I think Ron touched on it. How much does motivation really factor in? Have you noticed any changes with teams that just are never going to have a chance? Any other observations involving so few teams having a chance?
I think when teams have high expectations and things go south early, they stay south. Teams expected a challenge for the title. It could be a Miami of Florida, some very disappointing years over the time. Could be Washington, where there's internal and external friction because they're expected to challenge. When things start to go wrong with teams with high expectations, at least from my perspective, it really doesn't get any better. And they don't feel that a minor bowl game, going 7-5 and getting into the peanut butter bowl or whatever you want to call it, matters to them. That's a good topic for betting on against a bowl team. They're 7-5. They're going to a bowl. They were 10-2 the last 3 years. Do they really care about the game? Half the play, there may be some players that even opt out of that game. We've seen that over the years. So for me, those are some of the things that I might be looking at, motivation.
As far as from a handicapping standpoint, clearly college football is, the teams at the top are, separated from even the teams outside the top 5. So it is from that standpoint, if it enhances your viewing experience or your handicapping experience to have more teams having an actual chance to win, then certainly that affects it. But I really don't pay too much attention to it, kind of putting my own spin on it, as Ron did in a way. I look at teams that have maybe unfamiliar expectations on their program this coming season. So like last year, 2 teams, and played against these teams fairly often, and it was successful. But both North Carolina, which was a top 10 team in the preseason last year, and Iowa State, both had preseason expectations that were fairly unprecedented. So I like to use the same saying, I say the same things over and over, but, heavy is the head that wears the crown. So you've got a North Carolina team and a Iowa State team that for most of their football history, they have not been top 10 or top 15 teams, and they have to enter the preseason at that stature. They've gone all summer, what I call talking time. College football, there's about 7 or 8 months of talking time where everybody talks about you and you talk about yourself, and about 3 to 4 months of actual playing time. But they went through a lot of that talking time cycle, hearing about how good they were and how everybody was coming back and how they were going to be ranked so high. But they're not used to those types of expectations. So I look at teams like that, a couple of teams that I think are, potential for that this year, although I think they're very talented. A team like North Carolina State, Devin Leary's a great quarterback. He's a, fringe Heisman Trophy candidate, but he lost a receiver who's the all-time leading receiver, I believe, in school history. He lost a left tackle that was a very early draft choice in the NFL draft. And plus, they're going to be, I don't think they're going to be top 10, but they're going to be top 15 for sure in the preseason wire service polls. Will be NC State. So that's the type of things I look for, more teams that have unprecedented type expectations and might not quite be up to the burden of carrying those expectations.
You quoted my friend Rex in one of your podcasts, and you said winning is not an accident, which I love that. I'll first pose it to you, Ron, and then Paul. What changes have you changed with your skill set, so to speak, to sharpen your skill set? What adjustments are you aware of that you can share that you have made over recent years? Because I know from knowing both of you, you both know you can't stand pat. There's always an evolution. So, Ron, is there anything that you can share that you notably are doing different? And then Paul, follow up.
Well, like you've mentioned, gone are the days where you just played Ivy League football and you just rely on the running data. So every year, like you mentioned, Chris, before, you can't really rely on that too much. And maybe a little bit is what Paul said, because I agree completely with the fact that high expectations generally lead to inflated point spreads. And I hadn't paid as much attention to that, and I am now in this world where everything's known about everybody, and it's all about getting in the playoffs and getting into the Rose Bowl and stuff like that. The teams that Paul mentioned, plus Indiana of last year, was a play against team because of too high of an expectation. Probably the other thing that I have to adjust, and I'm still learning how to adjust, would be the transfer portal. How do I know exactly how the transfer portal is going to help or hurt a team? We know in general that USC is going to be much better offensively, but now you're asking a coaching staff that you have to trust that's going to build chemistry right away, and chemistry takes time. So what I've had to do is make some extra notes on my sheets. I have one sheet per team at the beginning of the year, and kind of see how the chemistry is playing out. How long is it going to take for this team to gel? Defensively, are we noticing any sudden changes that we haven't seen over the past 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years? That, wow, this team is really doing something differently. And if it's just 1 or 2 players that are filling in the gaps in the transfer portal, I think it's easier for me to adjust. But I'm still wrestling with how to use the transfer portal, and I'm looking for ideas as to how to do that. What if a team takes 3 offensive linemen and puts them into their mix, and now you have 3 new starters? They played a whole bunch of games for other teams. But to me, a function of a good offensive line is knowing what each other is doing on that play. Who's pulling, who's not pulling, are they working in sync? And now you're asking 3 people from 3 different coaching subsets to work together. That's the part I'm wrestling with.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with certainly especially the last part of Ron's explanation. You don't know how these guys are going to gel in, and the offensive line is the best example. And he put it very eloquently and appropriately, I believe. They've come from different systems. They don't have the advantage of having worked with the other offensive line to have developed into a unit that performs as one, for lack of a better term. So you really have to, watch games early or follow games early, whether it be, however you do it statistically, or probably that's where the eye test is a better use of your handicapping skills to see how these new pieces are fitting into the overall puzzle. But for me, with the game changing, with the transfer portal, Chris, I'm a specialist. I mean, I'm pretty much college football, college basketball, and golf. And especially the, put a lot of time on the first two, although I, handicap golf extensively as well. But the more chaos and confusion is difficult as it makes the process,
it's
and
better.
much more time as it adds to it. I want chaos and confusion. I want another layer added in.
Yeah.
Because I'm a specialist.
Right.
The bookmaker, he's going to be, soccer, whatever his different, the different guys who make the lines behind the scenes for different books. They're going to have their energies spread among many different sports. So they're not going to be able to follow each and every move. And having, I was formerly a sports writer, as you guys may or may not know. So I've been inside locker rooms and covered major college football. And that gives me, I think, a little bit of an advantage. And so I've got a feel for it. I think I know what to leave in, what to leave out, so to speak. And I'm, as much as it adds to my workload, I like the transfer portal. I think I can evaluate. I hate to say better, but for lack of a better term, I think it gives me an advantage over the house when there's more, more things to consider, more pieces to go over, and I keep up with the transfer portal religiously, daily, and as much time as I put into it, you still can't keep up with it. So you really have to. I've determined kind of some of these moves from one school to another are so negligible that you have to basically not even consider them. Your head will spin off the swivel at some point if you're looking at all these different transfer portal moves day in and day out. So, I try to limit them to players who they don't necessarily have to be starters, but if I don't foresee them being a heavy contributor at their new school, then, it's going to be something that I'm just not going to consider at all because it gets too convoluted. You've got one team, and I should know who it is off the top of my head because I tell you what, I think it's I've just about had it on the tip of my tongue. I don't think it's South Carolina, but it might be. But there's a player who was a Division II, a running back, who at the Division II level last year rushed for over 2,000 yards.
Wow.
A much lower level of competition, though. And now he's going to, I believe it's South Carolina. But, how do you, not that he's going to make a big difference on a team's power rating or the point spread. Certainly he's not. But, evaluating a player like that who accrued extremely impressive statistics, but at a much lower level of competition, how do you factor in a guy like that? So that's part of the challenge. That's part of the charge and part of the work that I go through daily.
You touched on an absolute brilliant point, which, pro bettors know. You throw more obstacles in the way of understanding what the hell's going on, and you're the first one to figure it out. You've got some really nice advantages for a while. And that happens with rule changes and scoring changes and all kinds of like the transfer portal and other things. So excellent point there. My belief is that you guys have sucked out nearly all the value, all the guys like Brad Powers and yourself and a handful of others. You guys have sucked out the value that's available there to be bet at the moment. So I've got no rush to go into college football. Do you guys kind of see it that way, that you got your stuff, and pending a little bit of news here, a little bit of news there. Let's just wait till week one and worry about college football then for the actual betting. Or are you guys optimistic that there's going to be betting all along going forward?
I'm going to guess that we're similar on this. Is that one of the things I do is look for outliers, and where you see if you have access to a number of books, you see it trending in a certain direction, and then there's only one or two books left at a season win total number, or one or two books left at an opening week one number. If you're trending in that direction, if you've done some work in the off season like we've done, then you strike right then. If you have formed an opinion that a coach, such as there was a coach at the University of Buffalo, I think it was, he went to Kansas last year, and he left on April 30th, I think, after spring practice, and he hired his staff in May, and he took 10 Buffalo players. The first number that was going to be available for the Buffalo Bulls, whatever that number was coming off a 9 or 10 win season, was, hey, you see this number, you bet it, you think about it later, because we're trying to form opinions as to where the market is going to go. So it's more than maybe I don't have all the answers in June or July, and I'm getting the answers as I'm delving deeper in these teams right now. But for me, if I feel like I know where the market trends are going to be, then I'm going to act a little faster. And if I feel like there's too much variance that I need to wait, then I'll wait.
Yeah, at this point, Chris, I think I've got 55 bets, mostly week one games and so-called games of the year. And my week one's basically done. I mean, for me, I won't do a whole lot more betting on college football until week two. The market by now, although not many people have entered the marketplace, because not a whole lot of people bet college football in, April, May, and June. The people who have entered the marketplace are going to be sharp players. So it's really the markets, I think, have matured at a faster rate because the almost exclusively the kind of guys who are betting these. So I don't see a whole lot of value in week one at this point, outside of just some new information or maybe just digging a little bit deeper. I'll certainly make some more week one plays. But what I'll mostly be doing, I might do a few more regular season win totals, because you can only do so much. And I probably, with regular win season totals being available on all 131 teams now, I certainly did make numbers on all those teams. So I've got some work I could do there, and I think there's still some value there. And one thing that's really critical as a college football handicapper is, with all these different operators in more than 30 states now, and with some of them wanting to be, first to market, you really have some unique numbers. You have more opportunities, and that's exactly what it is. You have more opportunities, so you have to take advantage of those. I mean, and a lot of ways, there's a lot of negative stories, and a lot of us can convey negative experiences that we've had with certain sports books and in certain jurisdictions. But one element of it that's still positive, as long as you're able to play, is the fact that there's, more availability, more accessibility, a wider range of betting opportunities, a wider range of possibilities. And if you're willing to travel, if you're doing it at that level, then certainly the door is open for some possibilities there. So I'll be looking for maybe some more regular win season totals, and I'll also be looking for some middle opportunities. On most of my tickets, week one and game of the years both, I have pretty good value. I don't want to misstate the average amount of value that I have on my tickets, but in some cases it's very very significant. So I'll probably be looking to play back maybe half of my original bet on the other side if there's enough of a gap there, and the number crosses over some key margins of victory there.
My comment on this issue is that I had an unusually good year last year in NCAA, and I actually probably worked it the least I have in years. I didn't even start. I think I skipped the first 2 weeks, and I may have even skipped the third week. So I was in no rush to get involved in anything, and I was in feeling no compulsion to, create bets. And I just wanted to make sure that whatever I was doing, I was comfortable with. So that's kind of what worked for me. Where everything's a little bit different for all of us. How do you guys view UCLA and USC going to the Big Ten, and the Big 12 is it looks like they're entertaining 6 teams coming from the Pac-12. How do you guys view these moves?
The future, the future is changing. The dominoes have started. When Oklahoma, Paul, you're closer to the scene of that, but when Oklahoma and Texas pulled off something that the Big 12 commissioner didn't know anything about, look, history just repeated itself. The Pac-12 commissioner, rival schools in the Pac-12 had no idea this was coming, and they were caught completely off guard. So we're moving to super conferences. The next, for me, everybody's going to wait on Notre Dame. Oregon and Washington are going to try as hard as they could ever try to get into one of these 2 super conferences. Past alliances, we know with Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, they're not as meaningful anymore. Oklahoma State was good about that. The other Washington and the other Oregon, they're going to. This is just the way things are, and we're going to. It's just a change. It's television driven, but it's just a change for me.
As a former media guy in Texas, your ears are always to the ground. What are you hearing that's going to happen there with the Big 12?
I hadn't followed it probably as close. I mean, with I say I hadn't followed it as close. I followed it very closely, but I mean, I've been looking more at the. As far as this stuff, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's in the background with me, but it's not going to take effect this year. It's going to happen. I tell, people ask me all the time my opinion, and I'll gladly talk about it. What's your opinion about the transfer portal? What's your opinion about, regionalism being eliminated from college football? And these teams like USC and UCLA who have no geographical connection at all, obviously to the other teams in the Big Ten. I mean, you're going to have a conference with UCLA and USC out here on the far West Coast, and Penn State on the opposite coast in the same conference. So, if they ask my opinion and I give my honest answer, I don't like it. I can't stand it. I mean, it's not the college football that I grew up with. It's not the college football that I love. But most importantly, they're never going to ask me my opinion. And I'm a handicapper most. Yeah. So all I'm going to do is respond to it. I think it's clear that the SEC and the Big Ten are going to be 2 of the power conferences. And I think now, and there's been some talk that there maybe only be 2. And they're going to be 28 teams each. And they're going to have 7 teams, 4 17 divisions. And I think now this reported Pac-12 Big 12 alliance, they're trying to get in the door and make sure there's a 3rd conference and maybe 3 conferences of about 20 teams, because people say this Super League is going to, consist of 60 or so teams. So I think that's what they're posturing to do. One thing I'm pretty certain of as a former news person is you can remember a few years ago, kind of backtracking a little bit, when the Big 12 got criticized when there was some change for not responding quickly enough, for not being proactive, for getting caught, with their feet in the sand. I think there's going to be so much movement in all this changeover between now and the start of the 2022 season that there'll be a lot of answers between, now and then. I wouldn't be surprised. Obviously, as Ron mentioned, I think Notre Dame is the, kind of the big carrot out there. That both the SEC and the Big Ten will go after. I think the Big Ten probably has the advantage there. And then behind Notre Dame would be Clemson. And I think the SEC probably has the advantage there. I had somebody tell me that, South Carolina, they don't want Clemson in the SEC. And some other teams don't want Clemson in the SEC. And I'll tell you right now that, the commissioner of that conference, Greg Sankey, will tell them, I'm going to do what's best for this conference. And we're going to accumulate the best teams we can with the brands that can get us the biggest TV contract we can. So Clemson will certainly be, I think, a pretty solid favorite to go to the SEC. But it'll be interesting to see the grouping of teams that comes to fruition in this third conference, because I think that's where most of the formation and most of the interest and intrigue lies at this point. But I'll just, again, they're not going to ask me, so I'm just going to lay back and see handicap this year. I think before, as far as Texas and Oklahoma, I'll share this, and this is through contacts in the media. Before USC and UCLA announced last week that they were going to the Big Ten, the thought was that Texas and Oklahoma would not join the SEC until 2025, when the current television contract with the Big 12 had expired and the exit fees were therefore not present. But now they're saying with USC and UCLA going to the Big Ten and starting in 2024, that they're going to go to the SEC and start play in 2024 as well. And that Fox and ESPN will kind of work everything out, because they are controlling apparently and dictating a lot of the things that are happening right now in college football.
Yeah. I guess my commentary on this issue is the sharper guys are going to be a little disappointed with this, because I think your edges are being able to understand the smaller conferences better and find your advantages in those conferences. And when you consolidate, it makes it easier for the normal person to kind of keep up on these teams. There's a way to reconcile where they fit in. It won't be year one, obviously, but over time, I think for the average person, like the NFL, you at least have some understanding of all the teams, just because it makes it easier to follow. If they were, if you had a bunch of different conferences, then it's harder to follow these teams and judge them talent versus talent. With that in mind, short answers. I want to know what each of you like the most about your handicapping in general. And I want to know what you like the least about your handicapping in general. Go ahead, Ron. Quick.
I like the most is my methodical approach. Same approach every year, same study, don't cut any corners, have the 95 teams that I have sheets on ready to go. Process that's worked in the past. I'll tweak it based on variability of scores and so on and so forth, the transfer portal, but it's the methodical nature where I do everything the same and I don't try to do anything, that's not a comfort zone to me. What I dislike, I understand the edges with the transfer portal, and I'll find them after week 1 and 2 and so on, but I kind of dislike not having status quo. I kind of dislike when you get thrown a curveball where it messes me up, where games start coming in on Wednesday morning or Friday, at noon, or, COVID cancels this or that or whatever. I just would rather be a creature of habit, and I deal better in the process part of it that way.
Paul?
I want to comment on something, if you don't mind, Chris, just backing up a little bit. I mean, you mentioned something that resonates very strongly with me, that the thing that I like the least about it is that we're going to this super conference of 60 teams. And like you said, the fewer teams to handicap. I mean, I call it, and I know you're a big NFL guy, and I'm really not, and I still acknowledge that the NFL is by far and away the king, but I call it the of college football. It's becoming more and more like the NFL, where you have a super league and everybody's saying, well, I'm so excited. You got to be excited. USC is going to be going to Columbus, every year or whatever. I don't want that game. I mean, those are two teams. Right. There's not going to be any edge to be found handicapping USC and Ohio State. Everybody knows about those teams. Everybody will know about UCLA and Michigan. I mean, you name it. The more you condense the field of team, the more difficult it becomes for the hardworking handicapper. So I'll, start there. And I agree, I think totally with you. I think my strong points as a handicapper, it's difficult to analyze yourself. And I hadn't really thought about it, but I'm steady and unemotional. I think the most difficult thing that we face as handicappers who actually bet the games is how do you handle losing? Because we're all going to lose. I tell people all the time that, some people, and they might be wrong, they might be right, but they might consider me an expert. But if I'm an expert sitting at the Westgate on Saturday morning and I say I hit 56%, but this woman down here with a double drink at 7:00 in the morning could flip a coin and hit 50%, there's very little difference in the two of us. It's a big difference in your pocketbook. But the point being, we're going to lose. And we're going to lose if we're really, really good 45% of the time. And there's very few people that lose that percentage of time. Most people lose more than that. So how you handle losing is very critical. And I don't know that I don't handle it as well as I would like, but I think I handle it better than most people. And I keep my head screwed on straight. As far as my weaknesses, I know I have weaknesses, and maybe I'm just too hard-headed to think about them. But
well, I wasn't really asking you a weakness. I was asking what you like the most about your handicapping and what you dislike the most about handicapping.
Oh, I mean, I dislike probably the fact. I mean, I know it's necessary if you want to be successful at it, and that's my goal. I always say I want to be a long-term winning sports handicapper is the hours and the commitment. And that, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but just the amount of time you have to put into it. And the fact that sometimes not only do you not have positive results, but you can have, negative results. And so, the time element, I guess, something that I don't like about it. I tell you one thing that's probably more in line with directly answering the question. I'm good enough with the computer, but I'm kind of caught in between a person who wasn't in grade school and in high school. Everybody didn't have a computer when I was growing up, certainly. So I wish I had a little bit more computer skills, although I've got enough. But I look at what I've done in college football, and I don't know that I could have, over the last 7 years anyway, could have done a whole lot better. But at the same time, probably my computer skills, I wish I was a little more adept probably in that area electronically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I cheated in college in computer training, and that was a dumb move on my part because I've got to have people that help me with just about everything, and that's hard. And I like one of the comments you made in one of your podcasts is, pros don't consider viewing pleasure in their handicap, and there's no truer statement. I could care less if I'm going to be watching the game or not watching the game. It's a matter of weeding things out. Just a last quick question. You've had some great contest success, and contests are hard work. Do you still enjoy the contests? I know you recognize the fact that it's going to be really difficult to repeat previous success, and that's absolutely true. But are you still having fun with the contests, or are they more part of the work process of where you think you have a positive EV over other players?
Yeah, I've had some success in contests, and I've got to wonder, maybe, those are days gone by, and should I be committing the type of requirement and work effort that it takes to be competitive in a contest? I don't think anyone's been as successful as you have, Chris, in the contest realm there in Las Vegas. So what it takes to win a contest. And I mean, obviously numerically, some of these contests have a high number of entrants, so the odds are really stacked against you. I'm thinking about that as I haven't entered any contest yet to this point. Of course, entry in some is just open, but I'm really maybe not struggling, but I'm evaluating, how many contests do I want to enter, And, how much of my time element do I want to commit to that? Because, I always talk about the rule of 168, and that's the number of hours in a week. And you can't do everything. If you try to do everything, then things that might be more important to you suffer. So I don't want to have my handicapping in general suffer at the expense of being spread too thin and trying to participate and win contests. So, I've had some success in contests, so I'll probably enter one or two again this year. But, I'm probably going to be maybe a little bit less focused on the contest this year than I have been in some years past.
Yeah, and I'm pretty much feeling the same way. Last year I did fewer contests than I could have, and I'm probably going to do fewer contests this year because of exactly what you've said. It's the weight of time combining with what's really important to you, because it's a lower EV in a contest. Ron, two questions for you.
Okay.
Are you ever going to do any freaking contests? And do you have any other final thoughts or questions for Paul before we log off for the day?
I have one or two questions for Paul. As far as contests, my initial reaction to contests is if you can't win a contest going 60 or 62%, because there's some randomness in it in some of these contests where you're only picking a fixed number of games. It's a really, especially having known you for the past decade or so, it's a really different skill set to me, how you go about picking teams depending on what the rules are and so on. I think it would take an extra time commitment that I wouldn't be willing to give. I need downtime to refresh the batteries. So at this point, I would say no. I just enter local things that have to deal with Survivor and whatever, where you put up your 20 or 25 bucks and you go from there. No for the contest. I have a pet peeve question that I need to ask to Paul, and it's not easy to quantify, but it's there, and I use it in handicapping. And I'll give you the Nebraska example. It just came out about 3 or 4 months ago that they hired a special teams coordinator. This is a major football college that did not have the position of special teams coordinator for 6 straight years, 2016 through 2021, no special team coordinator. And they finally acknowledged that they've lost a whole bunch of games, close games, a lot of one-score games because of that. It's hard to quantify, but how much value, if any, do you put on special teams when you're handicapping either before the season or as the season develops?
I'll tell you, Ron, you hit it on the nose, man. It is hard to quantify special teams. I think it's just not that predictive. I mean, historically, and it doesn't happen as much, in the past, maybe up until about 5-10 years ago, you could count on Frank Beamer and Virginia Tech blocking a bunch of punts and kicks. You could count on Air Force blocking punts and kicks. And I don't know that exists anymore. I knew Nebraska didn't have a special teams coordinator for a period of seasons. And I know this, and I'm not going to say it's because they didn't have that. But under Scott Frost in his 4 years, they're -13 in his 4 seasons in what I call net close losses. And I think this term's developed by Phil Steele, but it's games decided by 7 or fewer points. They are -13 in Frost 7 in his 4 seasons in games decided by 7 or fewer points. So maybe special teams played a role there. But, it is difficult I look at it, I examine it, but man, it's hard to know how much weight to give it. And things like that. I probably look at it more in a game closer to pick 'em. In a lot of games in college football, obviously it's not like the NFL where the best team and the worst team might be separated on a neutral by 17 points. You obviously have a greater deal of separation between college teams and therefore a greater amount of variance. And therefore special teams is not going to come into play in a lot of games, even from a point spread standpoint. But when it gets closer to pick in a competitive game, that's where I tend to look at it a little more heavily and look at the place kicker and the net punting and the return game and things like that. Houston last year, not to interrupt, but Marcus Jones, I think is his name. He had in his career, I think, about 9 touchdowns in the return game. So that was a guy I certainly took a look at. He actually beat me last year when they played SMU. At SMU, Jones either had 1 touchdown or 2 touchdown returns. But I know he was a factor, and he basically won the game for Houston.
He beat me too. It was they had tied the game, and he returned the kickoff with less than a minute to go, I think, to beat me in that game too, the SMU Houston game. So I understand that. I factor it in season wins, because if you're looking to see who's going to win the close games, who's not, I need to know who the kicker is. I need to know what the special teams history is. And when there's a track record and no changes made, to me, it's about attention to detail, not from my end or our end. It's attention to detail for the team. If Nebraska doesn't feel strong enough to have a special team coordinator, that's a red flag to me. I don't know. It's like the Dallas Cowboys, the old Washington Redskins. That was the last position they filled on their team, even though the kick is going to determine 2 or 3 of the games. The question is it going to be randomly for you or against you, or is there a pattern? So I'm looking for patterns, and I know it's hard to quantify, but it's in the back of my mind when I'm betting, like you said, that pick'em game or deciding to go over or under a season win total. That third component, to me, I still think it's an underrated aspect of handicapping.
I've learned over the years with you, Ron, that you're actually tracking this going back years, depending on the current staff in tow. So I think it's excellent tracking and has excellent potential value. On that note, I want to thank you, Paul, for joining us on this free-for-all. I basically call it the shoot the blank hour, and I appreciate you coming on. Anybody that's unfamiliar with Paul should find his podcast. I listen to it religiously. It's a short podcast, which is nice, 15, 20 minutes usually. So that's beneficial. But what else do you have to say about yourself, Paul, that you'd like to get across to the viewers that are still here?
Well, like you said, the Paul Stone Sports Podcast, I've been doing that for a little over a year now, and I've put out a podcast every week. So I'm proud of that. Focus on the sports that I handicap from a specialized point of view. Those sports, again, being college football, college basketball, and PGA Tour golf. Certainly from this point to the end of the calendar year, there's going to be a lot of college football. You're usually going to find a complimentary selection, or you will find a complimentary selection in the podcast as well. And if people want to go look at some of my other offerings, I also have a website, paulstonesports.org. So they can go to paulstonesports.org and see some of my other offerings. And I've enjoyed being on with you guys. Pleasure meeting you for the first time, Ron, virtually. Hopefully one of these days we'll meet out in Las Vegas or some other point and get to speak to one another in person. But it's been a pleasure being on with both you gentlemen.
It's a pleasure meeting you too.
It's a pleasure. I can't say it enough. One of the most important things you do in betting is try to network, and I'm fortunate enough to have both of you guys in my network of unpaid consultants, and I appreciate everybody. Ron and I have nothing to plug, so we're just going to wave goodbye, but we thank everybody for joining us, and welcome to ask questions and comments, etc. And we'll be back with another special guest. We're going to be keeping up with this NCAA a little bit. We got another special guest in tow next time out. So we appreciate you staying, and call it a day.